A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization supported entirely by your donations. If you've ever enjoyed one of our podcast episodes or classes, please consider making a donation of any size right now on our website at skepticspath.org. I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, where we share practical ideas from Buddhism to build happier lives, stronger relationships, and a better world. In this week's episode, I speak with Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, author of the Inclusive Language Field Guide. An academic for many years, Suzanne now specializes in analyzing and addressing bias at work, helping companies like Google and Reddit promote speech that's more inclusive and more connecting. After I read Suzanne's book, I was struck by the parallels between her work and the Buddhist ethical foundation of right speech. In our interview, we talk about embarrassing mistakes we both made in our speech, how to both forcefully and compassionately confront harmful speech, and how to recognize and transform the bias in our own language. Suzanne and I spoke for so long that it far outran our normal episode length. So if you'd like to hear the full unedited hour and a half of our great conversation, including many specific examples of ways to speak inclusively and compassionately, check out the Skeptic's Path YouTube channel. So, Suzanne, it is a great pleasure to have the chance to interview you. We've been friends for a while, and we both have books coming out within a few months of each other. And I read your book, The Inclusive Language Field Guide, through and through. Here's the evidence. Makes me so happy when I see people like that with my book. So I'm excited to talk to you today about how language is changing to be more inclusive and respectful.
I am excited to be here, and I love the journey that we've had with my book, where you were like, I wish I could have you on the podcast. And, I thought, actually, I think my book is very Buddhist in its underlying precepts. I thought, I'm not going to force my way on. But then as you started to read, you're like, oh, I think I should have you on. Buddhist practices is very much part of the book, and I'm so excited to talk about it with you today.
Yeah, and I want to get to that a little later because I did see some very strong parallels with what we call right speech in Buddhism. But just to start out, I'd like to know the path that took you to writing the Inclusive Language Field Guide. Particularly, what was the moment you first got curious about inclusive language?
This is maybe not what you would expect to hear, but my first curiosity about conversations that went well versus not and the rules that underlie them is when I was 5 years old and I skipped kindergarten and I went into first grade and I got dropped into a classroom of people who had all been in kindergarten together, right? And I was not really stunned, but I just was very confused about how to insert myself appropriately in the conversations people were having. And it felt like there were rules and I didn't get them. And so I had this curiosity. I'm like, I have to figure out what's going on so I can be a functioning member of this society. So very honestly, that's when I started. And that wasn't about, I think for inclusive language, we think about not offending people, not alienating people, being respectful. But here it was also just like what goes well and what doesn't go well.
And was there a moment in your life where inclusive language had some big impact on you? I don't know if it was a mistake or a way you helped somebody, but was there some turning point for you personally?
The book is a short version of my own learning journey, right? This is like, I started where many of my readers are coming from. Like, oh, what? Like, they're just being oversensitive, or I wouldn't mind if someone said it to me, or these are all things that I've thought. So I feel like I was in a fog for a long time. And then I got this education, which I continued with self-education with my research. And that enabled me to see patterns clearly. And what really happened is with the patterns, I started to see unfairness with a clarity that I hadn't seen before. So much unfairness, so much injustice, so many little cuts, death by 1,000 cuts. And then by learning the patterns, learning the impact, it so drastically changed how I understood the world that I couldn't not address the harm that people do in language. Harm mitigation became the cornerstone of my work.
Can you share some examples from your own life of that transformation?
Sure. I mean, I've got one from the book, which still sits with me. And the thing is that as you are mindful of other people, as you are attentive to other people, I think for many of us, when we inadvertently do harm, it just sticks with us for so long. I'm not even sure how long this thing that I said stuck with the person I said it to, right? But I had a colleague who came in on a Monday and was smiley. And I was like, hey, what's up? You look so smiley. And she said, oh, I had this really good first date. It feels really promising. And I said, oh my God, what's he like? And then her face just shuddered and she had to think about it. And then she said, actually, I date women. Like you could see her running a calculus of how trustworthy I was. And so I think based on all the other things I had said, she could say, okay, I can trust her. And I was just so horribly embarrassed because there I was teaching about language. This is early enough that we weren't saying LGBTQ+, but I was teaching about what we call heteronormative language. The world is set up in many ways, and it's slowly shifting, but the world is set up with the assumption that normal people or everybody is heterosexual, right? And the thing we're talking about now more is everybody is a normal person is cisgender. Like the default human is cisgender, is born into a sex that aligns with their gender identity or is assigned a sex at birth. And so I just am so grateful to her because it was such a wake-up call that when I went on autopilot, I just assumed, I just made an assumption, and the assumption was wrong. And so it started to alert me to, okay, there's a theory that I'm teaching, and I'm teaching people studies, but how am I implementing it in my own practice?
It's very kind of you to be so vulnerable sharing your stories like that. A quote from one of my favorite teachers, he said, as long as you call yourself a Buddhist, you are not yet a Buddha.
Well, comparatively, in the work that I do, it's the same. I give courses on ally work. How can you move from having good intentions to actually implementing them and when you see bias in action? And I say, I recommend not calling yourself an ally. It's like calling yourself a good friend. Or an example that somebody gave is a good lover. You're not allowed to walk around saying, I'm a good friend or I'm a good lover. That must be bestowed upon you. You can't use the self-label. And I'm like, just talk about the practice. I'm like, talk about doing ally work rather than. So I think it's a similar thing, right? You don't label, you practice.
Buddhist ethics has this core principle of right speech. And it has 4 points. Buddhism is very good at these enumerated lists. It has 4 points. I know you're not a Buddhist, but can you talk a little bit about how these principles of your book overlap with these millennia-old principles of how to speak compassionately?
So why don't you say one principle at a time and I'll translate them into my principles.
Speaking truthfully.
Reflect reality.
Speaking gently, not harshly.
Recognize pain points. Draw people in.
Speaking to bring people together, not push them apart.
Draw people in.
And speaking purposefully. The non-virtue there is gossip. Like, it's so incredible that we can speak from the Buddhist view. And you really want to use the power of your speech for something good in the world, in general, to bring people together, to create meaning, to help others. So speaking purposefully, that's what that means.
I'm just reflecting that every religious system I know has an anti-gossip principle of some kind. I mean, it's just so human. I'm just thinking about world religions and I'm like, oh, I can't think of one that doesn't have some kind of let's stop gossiping. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I would add to that, I have this principle called prevent erasure, where you're trying to not forget about people. There are so many kinds of people. So I gave that example. I forgot about lesbians. And I said, hey, just in that moment, I didn't forget about lesbians generally, but in that moment, I was like, hey, what's he like? Right. And I showed that my worldview wasn't including the person that I was talking to.
Okay. I want to go to asking about a counterpoint to speaking gently, which is how you speak without mincing your words. You talk about language that erases others' pain, lacks accountability. A very searing example is boys will be boys. How do we keep others accountable without using hurtful language? Like, where does gentleness, when do you have to be firm and gentle? And how do you stay respectful while correcting injustice in the world?
So, shifting away from the idea of gentle, although I'll talk about being kind versus being nice. I
Yeah.
think kindness is giving accurate, constructive feedback to people, as opposed to sometimes being nice, people will swallow it, and then somebody will go about creating problems and either not know it or not care and be put in check, depending on their intentionality, right? So, I think it is a kindness for the world to speak accurately. And rather than gentleness, I'd like to frame this as what I call linguistic distortions because I see this happening in the workplaces and I see this happening in my life and my friends' lives. So the two distortions I want to talk about are inflating language, where someone who is just behaving normally because or appropriately, reasonably, because of their identity, people treat that behavior as if it's inappropriate, right? So black people protesting are called rioters. Any people protesting are called rioters, right? Walking down a street, like it's okay to shoot them with rubber bullets when they're literally walking down a street holding placards. Is I was outlining the book during George Floyd stuff, right? So this was very top of mind at the moment. Also, we find, to bring it back to gender, women who complain about ill treatment are often described in inflating language: bitch, problematic, histrionic, emotional, oversensitive, when they might be talking about really bad stuff like sexual harassment or other kinds of things. So there are ways that reasonable behavior, especially when somebody's trying to give that kind of what I think of as kind, measured, constructive feedback. I just have so many examples of people saying to me, I brought it to HR, I brought it to my manager, and they said, "Ooh, you're really dramatic. Oh, you're the problem, blah, blah, blah." So that's the first distortion, is inflating language. And then the second distortion, which is the one that boys will be boys falls into, is what I call softening language,
Yeah.
where people will describe problematic behavior as if it's okay. And this is usually used for people with power. So, people with power, like a boss or a manager or somebody high up in an organization, a misbehaving C suite person, or people with power who have like social power because they belong to dominant groups, right? So, that's where that really falls in. And so those, I've been talking about cycles, right? And so this is a cycle too, where reasonable behavior by somebody saying, hey, there's a problem, that person gets described as the problem. And then the person who's really doing bad stuff is like, oh, he's a good guy, or oh, boys will be boys, or oh, he has good intentions, or she didn't really mean it that way, or she's just trying to be a good boss, or all of these things. And so I think that speaking gently is to call out those distortions and say, aren't we being inaccurate? Like, I find that this call for precision really helps me with skeptical people, right? Because from an engineering perspective, if you can't see the problem, how are you going to design the fix for it? If you've got distortions distorting what the problem is, then what I see again and again, for example, in companies, is people will lose high performing people because of a bully. A thing that I struggle with and many of my friends struggle with is, how do you have compassion for somebody who clearly has had a difficult life or been harmed in some way, and so they're like spraying out acid or they're punching you? It might be verbally, it might be actually physically, right? But usually it's verbally. Some kind of emotional abuse comes your way. How do you have compassion while still protecting yourself from them? And that's when I think being accurate about your language can help you make a decision. Like, when do I just need to step away from somebody because they're so problematic that it's not worth my effort to try to fix them? When am I allowed to save myself by stepping away, and be compassionate from far away?
Yeah, the Buddhist definition of compassion, is wanting others not to suffer. So it doesn't mean being a punching bag or allowing yourself to suffer. Like, the most compassionate thing in a situation where someone is abusing you from a Buddhist perspective is to get the heck out of that situation for both of your benefit, for yours because you're being abused, and for theirs because it's very bad for them to abuse. On the same front, I want to ask you about racist language, and this is a very sensitive issue, obviously. People say racist things. There's very overt racist things, and then there's racist comments due to implicit bias, which you talk a lot about. You're very kind in your book because you talk a lot about how people usually cause pain because they don't realize how their words are landing. How do you modulate? What's the best way to correct people in a way that's going to land and be effective?
I, I think it's funny. Here's a paradox I sit with a lot. In the US, being called racist is like one of the worst things that you can be called. And yet, so few people actively work to change their language and behavior to ensure that they're not called racist, right? It's so
Right,
interesting to me.
right.
And I wonder sometimes if it isn't paralysis, fear based paralysis. I am very kind in my writing and in my talks. And one thing I do is I really work to avoid language that triggers people and creates resistance and creates anger and stress responses. But in fact, in my workshops, in my private life, in my articles, I actually recommend avoiding using a label for anybody's behavior. This is my number one recommendation. So even though I reported a real story where somebody was told something racist and she's like, oh my God, I'm so like, stop saying kung flu. It's right. Like it's racist, right? I actually recommend never saying racist to somebody. So I say, don't say that. Never call someone homophobic. Don't call somebody transphobic. Don't call somebody racist. Don't call somebody sexist. None of it, because none of it works. And the label will trigger this terrible stress response. I mean, I personally have all kinds of problems with critical feedback just because of how I was raised. I wasn't raised with a healthy model of constructive criticism. And so criticism of any kind will trigger strong responses in my body. And so I'm always saying this in my workshops. I'm like, you don't know who comes from a background of abuse or a background of unhealthy critical communication. And so even your gentle things might be difficult. So if you're being critiqued for your language and you're having a stress response, one thing I'd like to recommend is take a few days to process, right? And so it can take up to 48 hours for chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol to leave your body after a stress response. So I say take at minimum 2 days to let it process, because when you've got stress chemicals flooding your body, guess what's not working great? Your brain and decision making for, like, should I shift and be open to something new? That's not happening.
So, with these guidelines on avoiding some of these trigger words like racism, are these applied across the board? What if you're a person who's part of a marginalized community and so on?
So this is an excellent question, and one I think a lot of people grapple with. And I want to talk about the difference between in-group discussions and out-group discussions. So in-group, where people have safe spaces, you can use whatever language you want. You can use shorthands, you can use advanced terminology, you can vent, you can say all kinds of things because it's meant to be a safe space to get it out. And then when you're talking to somebody in the out group who might not understand the perspective, for whom it might be new, a lot of people are at I would say like a zero starting point. Some people are at a negative starting point, right? Where you have to even bring them to a place. This is where I recommend being very, very careful with your language and using things like the concrete principles. So just up the road from where I was TAing in Berkeley when I was a young grad student, and I saw resistance body language when I was just giving peer-reviewed scientific information about gender bias or racial bias in language. So this has been a problem that I've been attacking in various ways and throwing things up and seeing if they stick. For a long time, how can you get people again to see the real problems of the world without creating how can you bypass the defense mechanisms? How can you bypass the resistance so you're genuinely persuasive?
So, it's a very compassionate approach to get people to hear your message. Where is that boundary, though, between safety and discomfort?
That's an excellent question, because a lot of people don't ever want to feel uncomfortable, just period. And they will claim things like they're being made to be unsafe when you're just trying to give constructive feedback. And it can be about anything, very honestly. There are a lot of people who are just resistant to feedback and being told you are creating problems with your behavior, and behavior can be words. And so a lot of things that will happen are tears, and then you have to go comfort them, and they become the center. That's a very common thing, or being angry, or being, a flip. Oh, well, I mean, So this is a very common thing that happens. It's called DARVO: defend, argue, and reverse victim and offender, right? And so this happens again and again when people feel discomfort. They will often, this is again claiming you're the problem. I'm not the problem. Why are you attacking me? I'm just here doing my job, or I'm just here trying to be a good parent, or I'm just here trying to be a good friend, or whatever. I think about growth mentality a lot. So this is a concept that comes from a Stanford psychologist named Carol Dweck. And growth mentality says that people can learn and grow and change. They're not fixed. And I like growth mentality. I'll talk about it a lot for people who are presumed incompetent or under-recognized. Like, growth mentality is an important part of inclusive hiring, for example. Just because somebody doesn't have a Stanford computer science degree doesn't mean they're not going to end up coding well for your company, just to give one example. Some people have been cultivated in their lives, and some people haven't been cultivated, right? And so just because someone hasn't been cultivated and have the opportunity doesn't mean that they won't flourish given, like a plant, fertilizer, water, and sun, right? So I think it's a similar thing with people, but a lot of people who are told by society that they're on top don't have a growth mentality for themselves. And so the problem with the safety issue is that people can become rigid, angry, fearful, and attack. And I think a thing you have to think about, if you're a person trying to talk through somebody who was either doing DARVO with you and becoming defensive and saying you're the offender, or is weaponizing their need to stay safe at all times and saying, it's my right to be comfortable. In learning and development, we understand that the only way that you can grow and learn is by having a period of being uncomfortable, right? If you're in a safe space is not a learning space. A safe space is an you already know it space. And then you can push people. Some people, for whatever reason, get pushed really far into what you can call like a freeze space, or just they refuse to hear and they move themselves into the freeze space. But the space that we really want to be in as much as we can is that uncomfortable pushing the edge space. And so the more you can help people do it or be in that place yourself, the better. If you're having an uncomfortable reaction, I think it's good to self-interrogate and say, am I uncomfortable because I think I'm a good person and I feel like I'm being told I'm not a good person? Because so many people literally just can't take constructive feedback of any kind, and they freeze and retreat. But then they're doing the ultimate disservices to themselves, because you end up being left behind by people who give up on you.
Yeah. So some of the things in your book, gratefully, I rarely hear in my personal and professional circles anymore. But something I do hear a lot in everyday speech are the intensifiers you talk about, drawn from mental health terms. Like, and sorry, I will mention them here, but like crazy good, she has OCD, I'm having a senior moment, schizo, psycho, mad skills. These are very popular phrases still in culture. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think, people have reactions of giving up the color of these phrases. I think it can feel hard to some people. Can you talk about how to deal with this, and also how to keep our language colorful too, without it insulting and hurting people?
So I'll focus specifically on intensifiers, but I'll say that in the US and many other English-speaking places, but my research really generally focuses on the US, we have this tendency to use mental health terminology for people who are mentally ill or mental health issues to intensify something. So it's human nature to want to use a kind of a shocking word to when you want to show how strong something is. And so intensifiers are one of the very few grammar words that actually shift a lot in a language. In most languages, grammar words are pretty stable. We don't come up with new numbers. We don't come up with new prepositions. But intensifiers shift really quickly because there's this human desire to really have very strong words. And that's why we have one of our strongest curses is used as an intensifier a lot, which is fucking, right? And we even use it. We have almost no infixes in English when you stick something in the middle of the word, but fucking is one of the few ones you do. Say fan-fucking-tastic, right? Because it's surprising, because it's a strong word, and because it's in the middle of the word, because there's this desire to amplify. So, because mental health issues are so stigmatized, have been stigmatized, are currently stigmatized, and will continue to be stigmatized for the foreseeable future, those words have an element of being very edgy and very strong. And also, there's often an element of being out of control, right? About being outside of the boundaries of what's defined as strictly acceptable. So, the problem is that, and this was a learning journey for me, people really get hurt. And honestly, especially because mental health issues are so stigmatized and can be very imperceptible, right? Even lately, I mean, and this is hard for me to get rid of my own thing, but like, oh, I'm going crazy. This thing is driving me crazy. I'm going to kill myself, right? Might just feel like you being like, this is an out of control situation. But for a person that you don't know whose sibling just died by suicide, it's quite bad. So my recommendation is to identify, this is another activity I give because this really takes time and I have a hard time with this, is find alternatives that you feel okay with. And you can actually get more precise, especially if you're describing it. A lot of people will use it in their employee experience interviews to describe a bad manager or a bad boss.
Mhm.
You know, she's psycho, she's schizo, she's always changing her mind. I'm like, but actually, if you get more precise, oh, she's so unpredictable. She's so temperamental. She can really change her mind so quickly. There's this way that if you get to something that's more granular about what's going on, and I'll add to this, we also have ableist language like fall on deaf ears or blind to the situation, which implies that people who can't see are making bad decisions or people who can't hear are making bad decisions. It's actually about bad decision making or not being attentive, right? So if we
Mhm.
get more precise, we're probably going to use some color. We're definitely going to lose intensity. I'm very sorry. Go for regular intensifiers. You know, there's a long list because we've been adding intensifiers in English for a really long time. We've got, you can move so far beyond very and really. There's really so many of them. But yeah, I find that you lose the intensity, but you gain precision for what is really the problem that's bothering you.
So when I first look at the table in the back of your book, there were a couple things, either rubbed me the wrong way or I felt like disappointed to lose language. One of them was one of these, the issue of sanity check and then its replacement being check. And I was like, oh gosh, I mean, so I was like, is there a way? But then I thought, oh, maybe a pre-flight check, like there is a way to maintain color and be respectful yeah, around these mental health issues.
So in the back of the book, I give a list of suggested substitutions, but I tried to caveat it a lot. And I have to say that for me, there are some things that I still have a hard time removing from my language. Sanity check is not one that I've used, but there are some other ones I can't think offhand. But the problem with looking at the table before you read the book is if I've done such a careful job of taking you through what I had to learn in order to get to the place where I'm making a recommendation, that I think a lot of people are like, oh, you're going to make people angry. I'm like, oh, like I wish there was a way to almost prevent people from going to, because I think that, okay, first of all, I don't like being told what to do. And if somebody tells me what to do, my immediate response is to be resistant and say, well, why? You know, and I come to your podcast as a skeptic. I come to the world as a skeptic, and I'm like, well, tell me why. Like, don't just tell me. Don't just tell me, well, I saw it in a vision or I talked to it, like lay it out for me. And so I was very hesitant to put a table in with just like do and don't, especially because also in the book I say, people say to me, just tell me what to say and what to not say. And I'm like, I can't do it because it's so context specific. But then there are some things that I'm like, okay, really, just this is off the table now. And I think that whenever you make a change to be more careful of somebody else, you lose something. You lose a
Mm.
certain freedom, right? There's a way in which there's always a balance, right? You lose the ability to go as freely on autopilot as you might be able to. There's a reason why we do what's called style shifting. We shift around and we speak differently to different kinds of people.
So there was something in your book that struck me very personally because my sister's autistic. And the ways you talk about autism are ways I haven't seen as much compared to some of the other issues in your book. So I'll illustrate this with a story, because the way my sister speaks seems quite strange to your average person. She's an artist, and I was with a friend who had never met her and found out she was an artist. And he said to my sister, "Who's your favorite artist?" And my sister said, "Myself." And that's very charming to me, as her brother, and understanding how her mind and brain work. But to, most people would consider that egotistic and sensitive. You talk about this in your book. Can you talk a little bit about how working and relating to autistic people and respecting the different way that they think?
Sure. And I want to preface this by saying that I'm deeply, deeply embarrassed by how badly my academic fields have failed to study systematic principles of autistic communication and compare them to what we call holistic communication. So you can't just say neurotypical and neurodivergent, because there are people who are neurodivergent who don't pattern the way that autistic people pattern, right? So you really
Right.
have to
There's a
be
lot of
very,
different ways.
yeah, exactly. So you have to be very specifically autistic versus not. So for my work, I've consulted with two linguistic grad students who are themselves autistic and studying autistic communication for their graduate degrees. So I was able to fix things that are wrong with what I used to say even 4 or 5 years ago. I used to say very confidently, human beings all this, human beings all that, human communication is this, human communication is that. And I really, taking my own medicine, I was doing a bad job. I was doing a bad job of erasure. I was doing a great job of erasure, but I was doing a bad job reflecting the realities of the world, because the idea that holistic communication is universal and represents everybody isn't true at all. But one of the biggest things is the difference between text and subtext, or being very literal and being filled with hints. So holistic people, I'm holistic, and so I love language that's filled with subtext. I love dramas that are filled with subtext. I watch a lot of Korean dramas, and Korean communication is often very subtext based, and Japanese stuff is even more subtext based. And so it's really fun for me to try to tease out, oh, what did that guy really mean when he said this thing? What are all the implications? Well, for an autistic brain, those implications can be completely invisible, right? So what we find is that autistic people tend to be very literal. So an example I give in the book, which is all of the stories in my book are real stories. If they're not public stories, I shift them so they can't be found. I anonymize them a little bit, but they're all real stories. So one story is an autistic man is quitting his job, and on the last day, there's a little get together, with a cake or whatever, and his boss says to him, "Are you sad it's your last day of work? Are you sad to be leaving?" And he said, "No." And everybody laughed like it's a joke, but this was no joke. He took it very literally. Literal question: are you sad to be leaving? Literal answer: no. I'm happy to leave. Like, I'm excited for this next job, and whatever. And so for an holistic person, that feels like a joke or an insult. Another example I have from the book, and I've heard this a lot, is I lurk on a lot of autistic forums, like autistic subreddits, to see how autistic people are talking to each other about the problems that they're facing. And what I see again and again in the workplace and in friend groups is people feel very ostracized, very misunderstood. They feel like people see them as harsh or mean, or making jokes when they're not, or not getting it, and they're just playing according to the rules of their neurotype, right? This is what communication is, and people are playing with a completely different set of rules, and we're getting this clash. There's somebody, uh I'll just say, okay, I mean, I'm not giving anything away. There's somebody at my publisher who, every time this person emails me, I have felt very offended.
Mm.
Every single time. He has managed to offend me every single time. And now with I went and I looked at LinkedIn posts and other things, and I'm like, oh, actually, I think this is patterning as a spectrumy way of writing. And I pulled a lot of negative implications out of his stuff. And once I read it from an autistic literal lens, I felt a lot better about it. I don't want to armchair diagnose anybody. This is a thing that happens a lot, and I see autistic people complaining about armchair diagnoses that somebody's on the spectrum. But having said that, if you just want to relook and say, is this person being literal? Am I pulling hints out that aren't there? I think that can facilitate a lot. And with your sister, why create art if you don't love the art you're creating, right? From a very literal perspective, if you don't love what you're doing, especially if it's art, why do it?
Yeah, exactly. Love yourself. My last question for you, Suzanne, is what you still want to learn about inclusive language.
Nobody has asked me this. That's a good question. I have to figure out how to get plugged in to younger people now that I'm not teaching at university anymore. So I left in 2011 and I was being kept, I don't want to say young, but I definitely had access to younger norms and ways of speaking and values, shifting values. And I have to figure out how to get better access to that again, because there are some things, for example, one of the most searched, the biggest hit article on my website is gender neutral sir or ma'am. And people are searching, and like 800 people a month come to my website from Google searching for it. And the answer is, yeah, we don't got one yet. Like, best of luck, but I think that young people who understand that a lot of people are non-binary, and people, especially in the American South, where it's common to address people respectfully, I think people are going to come in grassroots ways, natural ways, not what we call language engineering, where you've got a top-down decision and people make a top-down decision and implement it, but in more grassroots ways. I think people are going to be coming up with really, really good solutions for things that people in our generation are struggling with. And so that's what I want to learn. I just have to figure out how to get better plugged in, because I think that people will say things like Black women will save us, or the young people will save us, or the new generations will save us. I think we all have to save ourselves. But when people are coming with a different set of constraints than I grew up with, it enables them to come up with creative solutions that wouldn't occur to me. And I would like to have us all benefit from the creativity and generosity and better reflection of reality that I'm finding in many younger people in this country today.
Yeah, and they come to it for you and I. We see a revolution in language over the past 30 years. For them, it's the baseline, and it can be greatly improved. So that's a great answer. Well, Suzanne, I loved this conversation with you. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I was delighted, and I really appreciate your time and the care you took in writing such a fantastic book, the Inclusive Language Field Guide.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a genuine pleasure to have this conversation with you. Really, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for my conversation with Suzanne Wertheim. Her book is The Inclusive Language Field Guide, and you can learn more about her work at SuzanneWertheim.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider making a donation to our podcast. A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization. Our podcast is free and ad-free, thanks to our generous donors. To support us now, visit our website at skepticspath.org. We accept cash, credit, Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrencies, and your donations are tax-deductible in the U.S. If you'd like to deepen this conversation, please join our private meditation community and newsletter through the links on our website, or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thanks to Annie Nguyen for production and storytelling, Christian Parry for mastering, and Isabella Acebal for marketing. We wish you a wonderful day.